Yes. Well, for me this afternoon, this evening in Central Asia, this morning in the United States for broadcasting across the world today. I'm Adam Hugg. I'm Director of the Foreign Policy Centre, which is a London-based think tank. Delighted to be working again with IWPR and the Cabar Central Asia team. We have a packed agenda today looking at the situation in Central Asia, but also some of the global trends with a very special keynote speaker here today. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our hosts for today's event, Anthony Borden from IWPR, to say a few words of welcome.
Hi, Adam. Thanks so much. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. And yes, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. It's such a great pleasure to welcome you all to our online discussion, which we have titled Understanding Transnational Repression in Central Asia, Tactics, Targets, and Ways to Deter Them. First of all, as Adam mentioned, let me express our sincere gratitude and excitement to our distinguished keynote speaker, Ms. Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, We are honored that you should join us. Your presence here today designates how important our topic is for Central Asia and the post-Soviet world in general, especially in the light of cases of journalists and athletes and others being targeted by the government. We highly appreciate your participation and we really look forward to your important remarks. We certainly want to thank Adam Hugg from the Foreign Policy Center and all our other illustrious speakers for your work on Central Asia and especially the topic of today's meeting. This virtual expert session is a part of a series under IWPR's project titled Amplify, Verify, Engage, Information for Democratization and Good Governance in Eurasia. Building on our long-term work in the region, the project supports independent media and civil society across 10 countries in Eastern Europe, the South Caucasus, and Central Asia, with a focus on building capacity, supporting research and reporting, and tracking and combating disinformation. This project is generally funded by the Royal Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We sincerely thank the Norwegian MFA for being our long-term donor, partner, and if I may say, friends. The project promotes democratic growth, participatory governance, and cross-border cooperation by strengthening civil society and independent media across Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and the South Caucasus. The key shift from IWPR's previous work in the region is more prominent focus on tracking disinformation and misinformation, which is a key challenge of our time. Let me also thank IWPR's Central Asia Director, Abakhon Sultonnazarov, and our entire Central Asia team, who are just brilliant. They bring real dedication and excellence to their work on our program. Our topic today is critical across the region: repressive autocratic practices and repression in the global context. Central Asia, alas, is one of the global epicenters of transnational repression. All Central Asian countries have made the Freedom House rankings of leading abusers. Unfortunately, right after China are found Uzbekistan, Russia, and Tajikistan among the top 5. The current report shows the highest number of cases among Central Asian states originating in Tajikistan. So the choice of today's topic is of highest concern to the region's citizens, activists, experts, and CSOs, and decision makers. It is a critical subject for democratic development, and it is at the heart of our work and mission at the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. So we're especially pleased to see so many people joining us along with our great panel of speakers. I know we all look forward to a fruitful and highly informed discussion. Again, welcome and thank you all very much. And back to you, Adam.
Thank you, Anthony. As I said, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to chair such a star-studded and knowledgeable lineup for this event on transnational repression in Central Asia. It's a topic my organisation, the Foreign Policy Centre, has examined for a number of years, working with a number of members of the panel in the past. And through that work, we've seen how political pressure is able to be exerted on activists from Central Asia far beyond the borders of the region. We've seen assassinations, regular assaults and other forms of physical pressure from Central Asian security services and those collaborating with them, whether that's informally from pro-regime diaspora members through to the Russian and other security services. But also we've seen this play out in Turkey in particular and across both the Gulf and across the EU and UK. We've seen families of activists back home placed under enormous pressure, including the use of spurious charges and jail terms on those family members, with the goal of forcing exiles into silence or even to return. We've seen Western countries' asylum and immigration systems really struggle to cope with the complexities of these issues, with family reunification in particular very difficult despite the risks they face. We've seen online harassment of activists flow out from Central Asia to make life a misery for activists wherever they are in the world. And we've also seen ways in which activists can be put under pressure in more insidious ways by Western, often UK lawyers, putting legal pressure on those, exposing corruption or other abuses through strategic lawsuits against public participation, SLAPs, and other forms of legal intimidation, private surveillance, and other use of public affairs firms to blacken people's names or to promote narratives against them. It's a complex issue, and the situation, as we've said, in Central Asia has been the epicenter of much of this work on transnational repression, but it is far from the only part of the world facing these challenges. And since the summer of 2020, the eyes of the world have been on the unfolding situation in Belarus, where rigged elections, everyone knows, won by our distinguished speaker here today, was the result with the Lukashenko regime cracking down on the hundreds of thousands of people who've gone out into the streets and activists who have had to leave Belarus for their own safety in the unfolding tumult. And obviously we're aware of the case of the Ryanair flight with Roman Protasevich, who was who was effectively hijacked whilst flying over Belarusian airspace. And obviously we've seen most recently the tragic case of Vitaly Shishov, who was found dead in Kiev only a few days ago in very concerning circumstances. There are a whole range of examples that I'm not best placed to speak about today, but we are delighted with perhaps the best person who in the world to be able to speak about the challenges that Belarus is facing in terms of transnational repression and the wider fight for human rights across the post-Soviet space. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya here to speak to us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, thank you for this invitation to discuss a very difficult topic, transitional repressions in Central Asia, because it's similar what's going on in Belarus at the moment in Central Europe. Because you know that my country is now undergoing the traumatic process of transformation where many similarities with the other post-Soviet situations can be found, including Central Asia. And I really believe that sharing these experiences can be mutually helpful. You know, on Monday, it will be exactly 1 year after the presidential election in Belarus. These elections were rigged and stolen, and ex-president Alexander Lukashenko has managed to hold power by force. But he hasn't managed to normalize and stabilize the situation. And since August 2020, Belarus has been in a state of constant political and humanitarian crisis. And it's getting worse day by day and month by month. By May 2021, Belarusians have already seen the murder of at least 10 peaceful protesters, the imprisonment of more than 36,000, and criminal prosecution of hundreds by the regime. Despite that, Belarusians didn't turn to violent means in their struggle, and almost 1 million citizens supporting my proposition to organize the mediated negotiations to overcome this crisis. However, the regime refused the peaceful way of negotiations and instead chose the method of escalation. On May 18th, the main Belarusian independent media with at least 3 million readers across the country was brutally shut down and its editors arrested. On May 21st, a political prisoner and democratic activist Witold Shurak died in prison under suspicious circumstances. And finally, on May 23, the Ryanair airplane was hijacked and forcibly landed in Minsk, and the journalist Roman Protasevich was kidnapped. By doing so, the regime once again refused to be a part of the civilized world and embraced the role of international terrorists. The crisis in Belarus stopped being the local conflict about the presidential legitimacy and turned into the problem of regional security. This summer, Lukashenko has weaponized illegal migration through the territory of Belarus as a tool to create a crisis at the border with Lithuania and to provoke the European Union. How this scheme of human trafficking works has already been investigated. A large body of evidence is gathered to prove that the Belarusian authorities organized this flow of migrants. Lithuania took a strong position and started sending those migrants back. And the regime in Minsk answered this yesterday by spreading fake news about one Iraq citizen killed by Lithuanian border patrol, but no proof is given. Within the country, the repression has been intensifying to get rid of civil society in general. Dozens of national and regional media and more than 50 NGOs have been closed. And as for today, there are over 600 political prisoners in Belarus, and this number is growing every day. Peaceful protesters, political activists, journalists, and human rights defenders are targeted in particular. And since the beginning of August, the situation has once again become particularly intense. On Sunday, the authorities tried to force the Olympic runner Kristina Timanovskaya to leave Tokyo for Belarus in response to her denouncing the actions of the Belarusian Olympic Committee run by Lukashenko's son. Now she has arrived in Poland. Kristina's case is significant for two reasons. First, there was nothing political in her action. She only refused to run 400 meters instead of 200, which is not what she was running for. And second, in her case, Lukashenko's regime tried to implement its violence not in Belarus, but abroad. And only the quick reaction of Timanovskaya and Belarusian diaspora in Japan and local authorities saved our athlete. And this escalation of violence doesn't mean that the regime is strong. Quite the contrary. After a year of repression, Belarusians do not accept the new status quo and do not recognize Lukashenko as legitimate president, and neither does the international community. Even when the mass protests have become almost impossible, Belarusians find ways to show the regime that it's illegitimate. And this constant pressure destabilizes the system and forces it to make mistakes. And you know, yesterday my friend Maria Kolesnikova and my lawyer Maxim Znak were on the closed trial for the so-called seizure of power. But after almost a year in prison, they do not give up. They disagree with the charges. They continue to smile and support us all. You know, I'm sure that the only way out of the Belarusian crisis is through new elections, and the only future for Belarus is democratic, independent, and prosperous country. The experience of Lukashenko's regime and last year especially taught us that dictatorship is only possible if the society is passive and the outside world is indifferent. So I call for solidarity and support all those who are struggling for their independence, for democratic changes. And I hope that the peaceful resistance of Belarusians can inspire people around the globe to value democracy where they have it and to fight for it where they lack it. So thank you for your attention, and I wish you good luck.
Thank you so much for those words. Yeah, putting everything into great context. So I think a virtual round of applause for that. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are obviously conscious of how these techniques are being used to put pressure on people outside of the borders, and Sviatlana has just given some important examples in the Belarusian case. We know from old that the interaction between Belarus and the EU borders have been a significant area for transnational repression in terms of people coming out of Russia and trying to get into Poland in particular, for both Tajiks and Chechens, where there have been held up at the border and vulnerable to pressure from home country security services for years prior to the events of last year in Belarus. So we know the border issue is a live issue. But without further ado, I'm going to turn to our esteemed panel of experts who are Nate Schenkkan, who's the Director of Research Strategy at Freedom House, Isabel Linzer, who is the Research Analyst for Technology and Democracy at Freedom House, Dr. Edward Lemon from the OXUS Society for Central Asia, and Alexander Cooley. So we'll start our discussions with Nate. But before we do, just to say, please, if you have questions for the panel, once they have spoken, we will go to audience Q&A, and there will be please put your questions in the chat, and I will try and pick out and get our panel to answer as many of those questions as possible. So as they come up, please put them in the chat and we'll try and answer them at the end. But we'll start with Nate. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks everyone for having me. Isabel, unfortunately, is unavailable with another conflict, but I'll be speaking for Freedom House. It's really a pleasure to be invited to speak here, to speak with friends, with colleagues who know this topic very well. And I'm, as always, looking forward more to what others have to say than what I have to say. So let me be brief about how Freedom House approaches this issue of transnational repression in its contemporary context, what we see as the main features and how those may be manifested in Central Asia. To start, the way that we define transnational repression is as efforts by origin states to silence exiles and diasporas abroad through coercion. There are a variety of definitions for this phenomenon, different labels and names. This is how we are working. A couple of key points about that from just to clarify it, we take a broad definition of who the targets are. So we see transnational repression as something used against people for a variety of justifications. So not only against activists, journalists, human rights defenders. We are purposely trying to be inclusive of people who might be targeted on the basis of an ethnic or religious identity, or who are subject to persecution merely because being abroad makes them suspect in the eyes of their origin state, which does occur. Second, we exclude from our definition influence operations that are non-coercive. And this includes several areas that Alex has worked on, I think that Adam mentioned, but reputation laundering, influence buying, the inverse of these, frivolous libel or slap suits. These certainly can overlap with transnational repression operationally in terms of who the agents are or who the targets are, but we consider them outside of the scope of what we're trying to focus on in this particular question. Now let me say a few more concrete things about how we perceive the global context for transnational repression and what we consider kind of the most important points about understanding, defining, and then responding to it. The first is, I think, perhaps the most obvious, which is technological transformations that have really collapsed geographic distance between origin states and their populations who go abroad. We all communicate now internationally, as we're doing right now. It seems seamless. Of course, there's a great deal of apparatus and infrastructure behind it, but it is something that we live with practically at every moment of our lives at this point. And of course, that is especially true for people who have left their origin state and remain in contact with their home communities, with their families, with their business partners or loved ones or colleagues back in their origin. With that communication, exiles and diasporas are in a greater position to participate. We frequently see in this field, as I'm sure IWPR sees in its, YouTube, Facebook, other kinds of influencer or journalist activists who are using technological platforms in order to participate in their origin societies, almost as if they were there. Obviously, we know that there are differences, but there is a collapsing of distance. At the same time, that distance has also collapsed in the other direction, the ability of the origin state to reach back to those exiles and diasporas more effectively, sometimes using the same technologies as them, so monitoring through those public social media platforms, sometimes, of course, through using more custom technologies like Pegasus spyware, as has recently been in the news quite a lot. The only crucial point I would add on that is not to isolate the digital as a special area or something separate from all of these other areas. It's deeply interwoven now. We can't really speak about digital life or digital communication versus just life or communication. This is so much a part of the fabric of how we live. The second and less obvious, perhaps, or less discussed area of technological changes is cheap and abundant international travel. One small, like just the number of international passengers carried internationally has quadrupled from 1990 to 2019. People cross borders more readily, more frequently than they used to. It's no longer exceptional, even for people who are threatened in their origin state, to find a way to reach new international destinations, sometimes simply by purchasing a plane ticket. So in addition to the major mass displacements of refugees that we are quite familiar with in various regions around the world, the Middle East, Latin America, Southeast Asia, perhaps with Afghanistan, the Afghanistan crisis growing from this part of Central Asia, there's also a rising norm of international mobility. And this includes for people who face transnational repression threats, who are fleeing from an origin state, or as in some recent high profile cases I could discuss, where they are lured to more vulnerable jurisdictions from which they are then targeted or abducted. So then the second large area, so after the technological changes, there are significant changes taking place in international migration regimes. And the two that I would highlight are the securitization of migration, in which border crossing as something that takes place on a daily basis around the world is viewed largely through a national security lens. This in itself opens up opportunities for manipulation or co-optation of border crossing or migration processes by the origin states. Such manipulation can lead to detentions or deportations. The second is the erosion of the international right to seek asylum. Combined with the previous securitization, this makes many states more willing to engage in questionable or borderline legal practices to prevent migrants from reaching their territory or to comply with deportation and extradition requests from origin states. The third feature to mention, eroding norms against extraterritorial violence against civilians. I think this is very pertinent in the Belarusian case. This includes through the negative example set by the United States and Israel over the last 20 years in the respective wars on terror. The wars on terror have become high-profile demonstrations of how states can use violence abroad against those they designate as terrorists. I'm not trying to produce an equivalence here. I'm just pointing to the difficulty that it has created for an international community to sanction or to effectively place outside the bounds of acceptable conduct certain behaviors when they are being practiced very regularly by other leading states, especially the closest that we have to an international hegemon remaining. Terrorism as a label is a very flexible, very arbitrary vocabulary that really amounts to placing an individual outside the bounds of legal protection. And we see it very widely used in transnational repression. And fourth, the final factor I'll speak about is the changing geopolitical context. I think all will understand, Alex has written books about it. The global balance of power has shifted towards a more multipolar balance. More states have more opportunities for action, feel less constrained by a certain type of Western-dominated international order. Even that order itself, to the extent that it continues to function, is seen as permeable, as fragile, as manipulable, something that you can operate within to achieve your goals. And this particularly, I think, is how we need to understand the opportunities that even states like those in Central Asia that are relatively weak within the international order are still able to find opportunities for transnational repression through that order, even in established democracies, because for those states, this is a priority action in a way that it may not be for the host state to prevent. And then the other part of the changing geopolitical context that I'll highlight, again, I think Ed and Alex could speak about this, or perhaps will in more detail, is the new forms of regionalization, which includes regional cooperation against exiles. This may be on an informal and bilateral basis, as I think much of it is in Central Asia and Russia, or between Central Asian states and Russia, but it may be facilitated by formal mechanisms, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in this case. And this is not confined to Central Asia. There are examples of this in Southeast Asia, between Thailand and Vietnam and Laos. And there are examples of this in the Persian Gulf as well, through the Gulf Cooperation Council. And it's reflected in a very high degree of transnational repression cooperation within that region as well. So then I'll finish just two paragraphs about the Central Asian context and then allow Ed to go into it in more detail. Transnational repression is a core element of regime security in Central Asia. Central Asians are highly mobile, especially within the former Soviet Union. Of course, Russia is the most important host state, and this is reflected in the data set that we collected. I think this is reflected in others' experience of where transnational repression most frequently takes place, but also to Turkey and to some degree to Europe for certain populations. And I think it's once we take this as something that we understand as a normal or established part of political practice now in the world, it shouldn't be surprising that political and other forms of dissent find home in diasporas and exile groups who are leaving Central Asia, and that Central Asian states then transnationalize their own domestic practices of repression in order to cope with that dissent when it emerges abroad. And in doing so, they apply the full panoply of tools that they would also use domestically. Digital surveillance and intimidation, violent coercion in the form of assaults and kidnappings, and then in a way that is more transnational, manipulation of migration regimes through Interpol notices and through bilateral cooperation. Essentially, there are these very dense webs of transnational repression within the region that are formally institutionalized and informally practiced. And then there are modes of practice that extend out of the region to wherever exiles may go. And I think in this way, and this is reflected in the work that Ed has done and that others have developed over time, Central Asia is a very fruitful, very important region of the world for understanding transnational repression. With that, I'll yield my time. I'm looking forward to hearing from others and looking forward to all the questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Nate, for really kicking us off with a comprehensive overview of the challenge we're facing. I apologize for not mentioning this at the start, but one of my instructions on my list of things I should have read out at the beginning was if it's at all possible and if your cameras are working, please do feel free to turn them on so that we can see your lovely faces on the screen, so we can help make us feel more like we're meeting in person, as hopefully one day we'll be able to get to do again. Yes, so do feel free and encouraged to put your camera on if you can and if it's working. Anyway, apologies for not mentioning that at the top. Delighted now to hand over to Ed to take the discussion forward.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you to IWPR for hosting this very important event on a central topic for Central Asia. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about two data sets. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Central Asia Political Exiles database, and then I'm going to move on to talk about a new data set that brings our attention to Central Asia as a site for transnational repression, and that's the China's transnational repression of the Uyghurs data set that we recently launched at OXUS Society in collaboration with the Uyghur Human Rights Project. So I'm going to talk about both of these today. So in terms of, and this next slide, please. In terms of the Central Asia Political Exiles database, this was a project that was launched back in 2015, 2016 by John Heathershaw, Saipura Furstenberg, myself and various others at the University of Exeter. And this was an attempt to capture the scale to the extent it's possible using public resources of Central Asian states' use of transnational repression, defined as Nate said, as the targeting of citizens abroad, primarily in places such as Russia, but also in Turkey and countries of the European Union. CAPE and the new data set that we just launched adopt a three-stage approach to transnational repression. So the first stage is being put on notice. So this is when individuals are receive threatening phone calls, messages. They appear on Interpol wanted lists, for example, and effectively they are made aware potentially that they're wanted for supposed crimes back at home. Second, individuals are arrested or detained, sometimes when crossing borders, other times when going through background checks or other such things in a country abroad. And third, the end game, they're either formally extradited by legal means back to their home country, or they're rendered, which is often more informal, more akin to kidnapping. they disappear and we don't have any further evidence of them, or they're attacked or assassinated. And so within CAPE, there was an attempt to look at all these 3 stages. Next slide. And over the course of the period between independence of Central Asia and 2019, when data collection stopped, we found a total of 248 cases. Again, this is based on the public record, so it's not a complete data set of every single case that's taking place. But as you can see from the statistics, Uzbekistan, with the largest population in the region, perhaps unsurprisingly, especially given the repressive nature of the Krymov regime, was the leading Central Asian user of transnational repression. This was a number of different groups were targeted through this, but in particular, a group of interest was those who fled the country following the Andijan events of 2005. Tajikistan was the highest per capita user of transnational repression. It's also been a very active user of the Interpol system, the world's police cooperation organization, which is supposed to, by its constitution, not be used for political purposes, but Tajikistan has used it to pursue opponents abroad. Even though it constitutes 0.1% of the world's population, Tajikistan has something like 2% of the red notices or arrest requests in circulation through Interpol. So this really captured the dynamics, the groups being targeted, some of the practices that were being used against exiles abroad, and some of the geographic and temporal patterns that we see. And so based on this same methodology, late last year, the OXUS Society, we started collecting data on China's targeting of the Uyghur diaspora. Nate's report from Freedom House had shown that China was, according to his data set, the largest user of transnational repression in the world, perhaps unsurprising given it's the most populous authoritarian state in the world. And one of the main targets of this has been the Uyghur diaspora. So in our data set, we only looked at stage 2 and stage 3, i.e. we looked at cases of detention and rendition abroad based on public documents collected by human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Uyghur groups such as the Uyghur Human Rights Project, who are our partner in this report. And so we found 1,546 cases reported in the public record since the first case that we found in 1997 of Uyghurs being targeted in 28 different countries around the world. And I'll talk a little bit about patterns and where, how that's developed over time. What sort of practices are used for repression? Well, of course, the state security services play a key role, and they've developed close ties, for example, with the Central Asian security services. And as we've seen from recent meetings, for example, with the Taliban delegation coming to Beijing, their primary concern with regards to cooperation with Central Asian regimes, or one of their primary concerns, is over Central Asia not becoming a haven for Uyghur militancy. And this is not just a concern for Central Asia, but it's a concern for different parts of the Middle East and South Asia. They often work through the United Front Work Department, which is an organization that represents Chinese workers working overseas. They work also through diaspora spies and informants, often using, coercion by proxy, i.e. threatening people's relatives at home as a means to put pressure on members of the diaspora to spy and inform on their friends and contacts within those contexts. Of course, digital surveillance is a particularly prominent tool that they use, particularly against the diaspora and migrant communities living in the West. This is part of this is the first report which came out in June as part of a four series report on the targeting of the Uyghur diaspora. So the next reports will look at the Middle East, then the South Asian context, and finally look specifically at digital surveillance. And what we're seeing, for example, is members of the diaspora being sent links to install, which then when they open the message, it installs malware on their phones that can then record their conversations, download information from their phones. So we're seeing these sort of very sophisticated techniques being used by the Chinese government. We're also seeing pressure put on family members. As we know, with the current genocide taking place in Xinjiang, we have over 1 million people in re-education camps, and obviously the threat of being placed in those, or mistreatment of those who are in those camps, is a key tool to govern the diaspora living abroad. We also see the signing of extradition treaties and legal agreements, some of which are tied to investment agreements from China. And we see the use of multilateral organizations, which I won't go into too much because I expect Alex will touch on this, but we see China using the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has its own list of terrorists, extremists, and separatists, or the three evils that it's identified, which if a group or an individual falls on that list, when they cross the border of any SCO member state, which now of course includes India and Pakistan, they will be detained or have the potential to be detained as a wanted person and then sent back to China. We've seen had testimonies from a number of Uyghurs who've crossed into Kazakhstan, for example, and been detained or denied entry to the country based on this SCO wanted list. We're also seeing the abuse of Interpol, the world's police cooperation organization, with red notices being issued against Uyghurs purely because of their activism abroad. So next slide, please. How has this developed over time? Just one case study very quickly of how Central Asia has become a site for China's targeting of its Uyghur diaspora. In 2017 to 2018, we saw a campaign in Tajikistan to deport Uyghurs, mostly those who had arrived. They were Chinese citizens who arrived in the early 2000s to work in bazaars, mostly in Dushanbe in the capital city, but also in Hujand in the north of the country. And through pressure from the Public Security Bureau, which controls visa paperwork, and targeted raids in collaboration with the Tajik police and security services, we've seen 90%, according to estimates from filings that have just gone to the International Criminal Court by the Turkestani government in exile. We've seen 90% of that community disappearing over the past 3 years. I think this is very concerning because we're seeing Chinese security officials attending interrogations with their Tajik colleagues. We're seeing Chinese officials attending raids in bazaars to round up Uyghurs and deport them back to China. We see again the use of Uyghur informants within the bazaars to give information about the individuals and their whereabouts, and we see also seeing the targeting of relatives back in China. So Central Asia is a user, the governments themselves are users of transnational repression to target their exile communities, but also have become a site for particularly China's use of transnational repression. Not only China, of course, as we know from the case of Orhan Inandi, the Turkish Kyrgyz citizen who was kidnapped earlier this year in Bishkek and eventually ended up back in Turkey and was accused of being linked to the Gulenist movement. So we're seeing Turkey also coming into Central Asia to use transnational repression. So briefly to conclude, what patterns did we see from this data that we've collected? Again, it's only looked at detention and rendition. We're expanding this data set now to include stage 1 cases of harassment. We've already found over 4,000 cases of that. So we'll be releasing that data in the coming months. But what have we seen over time? We've seen, next slide, please. We've seen different geographic patterns. We've seen Turkey emerging as a major site, given the number of Uyghurs in Turkey living in the diaspora community. We've seen Malaysia, Thailand emerging because they're key transit points for people trying to flee China. Thailand also has one of the most restricted immigration environments in the world, and so we've seen a number of people being detained at the border and then sent back to China. Egypt, we've seen in 2017 some over 200 students being arrested who were mostly studying at Al-Azhar University. In that case, many of them were sent messages using WeChat and told to come back to China, and some of them went back voluntarily to then face arrest. Others were forcibly detained and deported back to China. We've seen most of the cases happening in the Muslim majority world. Of the 1,546 cases, 647 in the Middle East, 665 in South Asia, and so over time, we've also seen a massive increase in the number of cases. Next slide, please. So we're seeing, as you can see, a real peak, particularly in the period after 2013, when we have Xi Jinping coming to power. We have the intensification of repression within Xinjiang. Next slide. And between the first period, we split our data set up into 3 phases. The first period between 1997 and 2007, we only see 89 Uyghurs being targeted, as you can see, mostly in countries of Central Asia and South Asia. And then in the second phase between 2008 and 2013, we see 130 individuals targeted. You can already see from our heat map the expanding scope of this, including to areas such as Southeast Asia, as Uyghurs were trying to flee the country. And we also see, in the final stage, we see a massive intensification. We see 1,327 cases of the 1,546 in this final phase, as China's transnational repression really does go global. We see countries such as Italy, Bosnia, Russia, the countries of Central Asia again, also the countries of the Middle East. And so we're seeing an intensification of this. And with that, I think I will end and have some recommendations based on the report, but maybe you can address those in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Ed. And just to pick up on something I said at the beginning and a question that has been raised in the chat just now, the answer, is there a Q&A section? There is a Q&A session coming after us speaking, but there isn't a Q&A box because this is a meeting format rather than webinar format. So if you want to ask a question once Alex has spoken, please put your questions in the chat box. I will pick them up and then present them to our speakers. So I am delighted to hand over to Alex to close off our initial discussions before we get to that Q&A session. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Adam. Thank you to IWPR and Cabar for the invitation, and also to this distinguished panel of experts and practitioners. It's a real honor. Nate and Ed have covered a lot of territory, so I won't. I'll try not to overlap, but I'll rather fill in with some of the points they made with some nuance and additional context. I think it's very important to understand that a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the rise of transnational repression as a phenomenon is inherently tied to the parts and aspects of globalization that we don't like to talk about, or at least we didn't think about initially as having this kind of repressive downside, yeah? And so the title of my presentation is What's New About the New Transnational Repression? As a phenomenon, this is not new. We have plenty of famous historical examples, you know, Stalin going after Trotsky in Mexico City, London being used as a site for Middle Eastern dictators in the 70s to take down former opposition leaders and potential political rivals. But I think there's kind of three important trends here that is adding to sort of the potency and the acceleration of the phenomenon that have been identified, I think, by previous speakers. So Nate mentioned technology. This is absolutely key. And think about how we used to think about technology, that it would be emancipatory, that it would empower NGOs and political dissidents, that activists could use new information technologies to boomerang around authoritarian governments and practices. And now we're seeing the exact inverse, right? That spaces that used to be considered safe, communities that used to be considered safe, are no longer. That even in countries like the UK, the United States, Sweden, diasporas and exiles can be infiltrated, harassed, and intimidated. And the proximity of technological communication also enables additional sources of leverage. Threats against family, surveillance against family members that are back home can be accomplished on the cheap and can also be communicated in a very straightforward manner to what's going on abroad. So this compression of time and space enabled by digital technology can be used as much for repression as it can for emancipatory types of aims. And so I think we need to sort of, understand sort of the, technology itself. It's not inherently repressive or, emancipatory. It can be used for either purposes, and we're seeing, the trend there. I think the privatization and the use of private company, open market surveillance software, a lot of it which is manufactured in Europe, is still an underplayed story. And I think that gets us sort of stories of potential accountability, right? Whether it's possible to engage in strategic litigation against these companies if you have been targeted using their products for violation of human rights purposes. That's not possible for non-citizens in the United States, but that might be able to be something that can be explored more in the European Union context. So technology is important. B, growing authoritarianism, right? And so what we've seen since 2005 in general is, the increase in metrics and indicators of autocracy across the world. Eurasia and Central Asia is certainly there. And there's a kind of a sequencing phenomenon going on. As rulers and dictators, and importantly, their security services, consolidate control at home, they push political opponents, dissidents, they recode former legal opposition members to be illegals, they push them abroad. The next logical extension of this, after you have gained control of space domestically and internally, is to now use these new tools to go abroad, right? So in part, this push on the transnational front is an extension of consolidation of authoritarian rule at home. I think this is clear in the Turkish case. I think this is clear also in the Tajik case with the unraveling of the post-Civil War, peace settlement. And then so I think we need to recognize that we can't separate these phenomenons, right? What's happening in the transnational, international context with what's happening at home. These are part of the same kind of regime survival strategy and their use. I want to pick up a little bit on Nate's really important point, and Nate and Ed discussed this too, about this international normative and legal context. And here we can parse this out. I think it's important to realize that rulers and their security services, authoritarians and their security services, now have a very broad toolkit for both practically targeting people operationally and then justifying it. They don't just invoke one principle or one idea or one law. And what you've seen in Central Asia are some of the various modes of transnational repression, how they're justified. So yes, post 9/11, the US-led global war on terror was absolutely critical in creating a normative shift. Kim Lane Shepley has talked about the introduction of a state of emergency globally, where global war on terror norms started to privilege anti-constitutional ideas and practices, most notably creating parallel tracks of justice and security for those accused of being terrorists and extremism, as opposed to using the domestic criminal system, right? That's the big one. And so what you see in the US case is sort of terrorism being used as a category that's beyond the law, beyond security-related international legal protections. When we talk about what happened in Guantanamo Bay, we talk about the justification of renditions, especially cooperation between US intelligence services, their contractors, the government of Uzbekistan, especially between 2001 and 2004, and the use of a network of black sites within Europe to facilitate these renditions. But again, the justification for these is that they are not, this is not a conventional war. This is not a state party. These are individuals who are enemy combatants, and so they are not afforded the protection of the law, right? So it's a separate category. At the same time, we see this pioneering of, Nate mentioned this, these new regional legal frameworks. So if the US is saying the law doesn't apply here, but Russia and then China, increasingly the Central Asian countries, are saying, actually, we are now developing new regional legal frameworks to justify this transnational cooperation. And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is chief among them, but also the Minsk Convention has been used in this regard. And I think the key here is that according to the 2009 SCO anti-terror treaty, you have a number of transnational provisions that, yes, you are allowed as a member state to request the extradition of another member state, person fleeing to another member state without evidentiary standards, without political asylum hearings, and just basically based on a very low threshold of evidence. The treaty also allows for the pursuit by the security services of one country for 30 days into the territory of another, thereby greenlighting extraterritorial security operations.
And as was mentioned before, the SCO, the regional anti-terrorist structure based in Uzbekistan, keeps two blank lists, one of individuals and one of organizations, with no clear criteria of who is the procedures for listing someone and delisting someone. The SCO's mission is to combat the three evils: extremism, terrorism, and separatism. We know about the definitions of terrorism, but the definitions of separatism and extremism are even more legally precarious. And there's no clear specification. What are the criteria for having someone listed? Instead, what we see is this explosion of listed individuals and organizations. So we have gone from an initial list of 15 people in the early 2000s, 15 organizations in the early 2000s, and a couple of dozen people to last data I saw 5 years ago was 50 organizations and over 2,500 people. And Matt Schaaf and I have written a little bit on this. So what's going on? What's going on is that each member state of the SCO is listing their pet political dissidents, right? And they're accepting this designation in exchange for recognizing each other's, right? Those of you familiar with American politics might know the concept of log rolling, right? Where you make these reciprocal trade-offs. And so we've seen this phenomenon at the regional level. And so what the regional framework does is it insulates regimes from their international humanitarian and legal human rights obligations, yeah? And they can invoke the regional context, whether it's being used or not formally, it's some justification. We've seen this, right? Kazakh prosecutors handing over Uzbek exiles, invoking the SCO treaty, and so forth. So I think this legal dimension is a really interesting one. And what you've seen in Central Asia is both sort of transnational repression being invoked as beyond the law and also justified by the law, right? As well as different informal mechanisms. So what can be done about all this? Well, I know we're short on time, but I think beyond the excellent recommendation in Nate and Isabel's report, which I encourage everyone to read in terms of, the targeting of individuals with sanctions, sort of, strengthening the law enforcement understanding of this type of phenomenon. I think we really need to rethink how we approach groups like the SCO. I think the kind of prevailing wisdom has been to avoid it. And the argument has been, we engage with it or not, right? We need the SCO maybe on Afghanistan. So let's set aside all this other stuff and talk to them about Afghanistan, right? And these are similar arguments that are made about the CSTO and so forth. I would argue that's probably, for me anyway, that's the backwards way of looking at it. I think if you do not engage with regional organizations, they become increasingly more networked and connected. Their norms start to take over the ecology of global norms, to use that metaphor. So I think there should be an EU SCO dialogue, but the questions of human rights safeguards should be absolutely firmly on that dialogue. In other words, it should be sort of a comprehensive engagement, at which point there needs to be an indication what international standards are being used to list and delist people, right? What are the human rights safeguards and protections, and so forth and so forth. In other words, it's no good pretending that these kinds of alternative frameworks don't exist anymore. I think for the first 10 years, there was this tendency in Western diplomatic circles to say, come on, no one takes this seriously, or it's clear that these are not legitimate norms. That's just no longer true empirically. And I think what Central Asia shows is that in a quite significant period of time, normative standards and practices can change very quickly. I'll leave you just with this thought. It used to be the case that country, first of all, Russia used to be a safe haven for Central Asian exiles and political dissidents in the 1990s, but that's where there were. It used to be that Turkey was a safe space for Central Asian exiles and political dissidents. And so what you see is this rapid expansion of what's a safe place and what's not, to the point where nowhere is safe anymore, to sort of quote the title of the Freedom House report. And I think that's deeply disturbing. And I think Central Asia is a real example that if left unaddressed and left unchecked, the preferences of autocrats to go after their political dissidence abroad is much stronger than kind of a passive acceptance that these existing structures that we have and protections are somehow going to dissuade them. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for that tour de force. We have had some very important points raised in those opening remarks. Please, can I encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A box, and they are finally beginning to do so. So I will start with a couple of questions. One from Jamshed. He says, from discussions, it seems that most transnational repressions are happening in eastern and southeast part of the world. According to you, why should Central Asian or other dictators, dictatorships or Russia care about democracy and human rights when the United States was saying the law doesn't apply in the post 9/11 day? So how much damage did the war on terror do? How is it possible to reset international global human rights standards in that context? And obviously some of it will be whataboutism, but there is lasting damage that has been done to global norms, and yeah, so in terms of getting them to prioritize those issues. There was a question, I think primarily for Ed, about from Mehmet, which was about sort of what the situation is in Turkey, and how are there more people potentially at risk in Turkey, and so how does that weigh up on a comparative basis by population? So there are a couple of things there, and we've also got one from Sergey about the prospects of Elon Musk's Starlink solving the digital lockdown from autocratic regimes in Central Asian world. That's not I literally have no idea about that, so I'd be interested to know who does. So there's a couple of things there. I'd also want to throw into the pot. One of the issues that was always picked up a couple of years ago was the abuse of Interpol by these regimes. Something I looked at in the sort of mid 2010s, but I'd be interested to know how people feel the reform process is going inside Interpol as it relates to these kind of pressures from Central Asia. So should we kick off with those questions and see who wants to come in on any of those, and then we can hopefully get some more questions in the box. So US damaged by the war on terror and hypocrisy, issues around Interpol, Elon Musk, and the situation in Turkey. Nate, you're in Turkey, so I don't know which one.
Well, I'm not in Turkey at the moment. Thanks. Oh, sorry. It's all right. I'll leave Turkey to Ed, because I think it was a question to his data set, and also let Ed speak about Interpol a little bit, though I can reflect on some of the recent abuses that we've seen. I mean, my short answer is that the reforms clearly didn't go far enough, because we clearly see a lot of abuses taking place in real time. I can cite very specific cases where Interpol was abused recently, in which people have been detained and in a couple of cases kidnapped. On the US, I mean, look, if the question is why should one care, I don't think that's what I don't think we're arguing that one should not care. The reason one should care is because these are your fellow citizens, and these are the people of your countries. These are Central Asians, and these are people who want, in many cases, who want democratic reforms in Central Asia. It's a self-interested argument. It's the same reason why I think the US should stop using these extra legal justifications as well for its own prosecutions. I think, as an American, as someone who lives in America most of the time and speaks frequently in America, I think it's incumbent on me and on us, on our organization, to speak about American abuses when they occur, and certainly when they have this norm-setting role. We can't ignore them. We can't set them aside. So that's why we've foregrounded them and made it a key part of this conversation, because it's a fact. But I don't think that's an excuse for then why we stop. I think that's a reason why you push back on it. That's a reason why we try to reverse those trends, including in the US, including in the way the US prosecutes its own war on terror, or whatever we're calling it now that we've dropped that nomenclature for a while. Let's see, on so I don't know much, if anything, about Starlink. I will say this: I think that the fundamental problems aren't internet access, right? So if the problem is providing people access to the internet, that's not the issue. The issue is the security of that access, and interception is only a kind of a footnote within that security equation. let me give a concrete example, which is that for many years, people have been urged to use end-to-end encrypted messaging platforms, and that's now become an industry standard, even in the commercially distributed platforms like WhatsApp, right, or Telegram. And the reason for that was so that there could be no interception in between in the communication. End-to-end encryption is fantastic and it offers you a lot of protection. It doesn't offer you protection if you have a security agent inside of your home, as is often the case with people communicating with people in China, or maybe the case in parts of Central Asia. If someone obtains your device, it doesn't really protect you. And I don't see why a different internet access option would change that equation. The issue is not that the digital is somehow separate or that there's going to be a technical solve for very fundamental security and political economy kind of questions, around how these societies are repressed domestically. So that's sort of my short answer. Yeah, and I'll let Ed speak perhaps a little bit more about Turkey, Interpol, and Alex, of course, anyone who wants to.
Well, Ed, do you want to take up Nate's challenge?
Sure. Yeah, I think just briefly on the point of the war on terror, I think Sean Roberts in his recent book makes a very convincing argument of the way that China moved from a discourse in the 1990s on, which was more focused on separatism and nationalism from the Uyghur community towards rebranding and really picking up on this global discourse and framing their struggle against Uyghur terrorism, as they would frame it, as being part of this broader global campaign. So I think looking at the intensification in our data set, it's very evident, that's gone in lockstep, as to speak to Alex's point of the interaction between domestic and transnational, it's gone in lockstep with, ongoing developments, very obviously alarming and upsetting developments within Xinjiang, or the homeland. So yeah, I think the US has done tremendous damage, but as Nate said, I think that doesn't negate the continued desire of many people in Central Asia and elsewhere to live in more open and free societies. Specifically with regards to Turkey, yes, I think Mehmet's point was that it's unsurprising that Turkey has appeared with the largest number or second largest number in our data set because of the size of the diaspora community there. It is the largest community of Uyghurs outside of Xinjiang, and so as you say, it is unsurprising that it's topped that list. If we're looking on per capita terms, countries like Egypt, with its relatively small Uyghur diaspora, would have much more, a higher per capita number of people being detained. So there are obviously alarming developments within Turkey. There's the potential for the ratification from the Turkish side of the extradition treaty that the Chinese side has already ratified, and that would of course streamline the process of individuals being extradited. On that precise point, we're currently working on a smaller research paper specifically on Uyghurs in Turkey and their targeting. So watch this space for more findings there. In terms of Interpol, I think part of the issue, there has been a reform process. It's been spearheaded by groups like Fair Trials International, and in the US, on the side of lawmakers, the US Helsinki Commission in particular, which helped introduce new legislation to promote the combating of Interpol abuse by the US government back, it was introduced in 2019 and then reintroduced earlier this year. I think, some of those positive developments include those who have asylum in another country can petition to have their red notice or arrest requests removed from Interpol databases. An example from Central Asia is Muhyiddin Kabiri, the head of the Islamic Renaissance Party, who successfully petitioned to have his Interpol red notice removed. But of course, many, many challenges remain. I think there's still somewhat of a lack of will and certainly a lack of capacity from Interpol to change. I think a strategic law enforcement culture prevails within the organization, by which they still view combating crime as the main function of the organization, and this comes before any of the negative potential downsides of that, which include individuals being targeted for political purposes. We see an organization that's very opaque. We can't really understand how its inner workings work. They don't publish data, for example, on the most abusive countries, or they haven't done so for many years. And we see a lack of capacity because the number of red notices have surged from like 1,300 in like 2002 up to like 60,000 today. So, even with the best will in the world, they would need a much larger team than the team that they currently have, which numbers in the low dozens, I believe, to review all of those red notices, and diffusions, which is an even easier way, which is effectively like you have all the police forces of the world on an email chain, and you click send all, and you just very quickly can send information about someone who wants to be detained. You know, preventing these sort of abuses is going to be challenging, and it looks like Interpol has its work cut out. So I will finish there and hand over to Alex.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, a couple of points on this. You know, I think the response to US-led hypocrisy, and when you're a hegemon, you're a hypocrite, right? Because you are managing a number of different relationships. You know, hypocrisy is the glue that keeps the order together. But the response to that is, you know, not a kind of a global whataboutism. The response is to hold everyone to account. And again, these are human rights obligations, commitments that these countries have signed on to. Right? As China and Russia and the Central Asian states and the United States have signed on to these conventions, right? And so, so that's the point here. I think the point about the US is that there has never been an accounting for these practices, yeah? And I think this is, the big knock on the Obama administration's decision not to revisit the legal basis and the abuses in the name of global war on terror, right? Not to have the kind of investigation and commission that was needed for the sanctioning of some of these practices. Spotlight does work in certain mostly free societies, right? And so you saw, for instance, after the big New York Times expose on the Uzbek renditions, that the practice was pretty much disavowed and it was dropped. So I don't think, you know, we shouldn't go down the sort of the road of equivalency here. We need to look at the analytical nuances playing out in each case and what are the mechanisms of accountability in other. You know, the other thing that went on in Central Asia was geopolitical competition made Moscow, especially in Beijing, much more ready to curry favor with Central Asian rulers and basically sort of support these kinds of authoritarian practices, right? So you see an intensification of both legal and informal cooperation amongst security services, because this is one thing that they can offer, like unequivocal support for what you're doing, as opposed to the EU and the US, which frankly, during the 2000s, the messages was mixed. We had some security service cooperation, some security assistance, we had bases and logistical agreements. On the other hand, we were like super critical of negative democratization trends. And you saw this play out in the backlash of Andijan, right? Where the Pentagon took one line, the State Department took another line. There was no such ambiguity in the case of Beijing and Moscow, right? They backed these regimes and practices sort of all the way. So I think there's a lot of nuance there. And again, this changes so quickly. One thing I would say on Turkey, in 2009, you have the so-called Urumqi riots, right? In Xinjiang, you know, this is, you know, violent episode. Who is the leading critic, right, of Chinese practices in 2009? It's Erdogan initially. And he's referring to this practice as a genocide against the Uyghurs, right? He's using very strong inflammatory language. What happens? Chinese send a delegation over there, they intensify cooperation. Within, Ed would know this better than I do, but I think within 6 months, the tune out of Ankara is the opposite. They change, right? They reverse on a dime. And now, of course, when you think about Belt and Road types of initiatives and cooperation and so forth. So again, you know, there's not a lot of consistency in these positions, right? And so I think if you want to look at a silver lining is that normative change can happen quickly. It's happened for the worse. But my hope is that it can also happen in the other direction if we get, again, the mechanisms of accounting and sort of spotlighting right.
Brilliant. Thanks. Thanks very much for that, Alex. We had a couple more questions. Firstly, from Peter Frankopan, an important question. One, I don't know whether we'll have the answer that he's looking for, but I'm intrigued to know. Peter says, wanting to be positive, can the panelists give some examples where progress has been made across the region and how best to build on to embed, enhance, and facilitate further advances. I mean, I presume that's in relation to the broader questions we're talking about today. And if so, how and why have these gains been made, and what enabled these? So some good news. That would be great if there is some that we can share. And then Shoira Alimova was asking about the situation inside Central Asia. So, and what the international community can do about that. I mean, I think as it relates, I mean, I know she was interested in sort of country level human rights stuff, but I think in particular, there's also, you know, we've touched on the sharing of surveillance tech, how that's being applied at a local level, how the sort of shared security norms and interagency cooperation between different countries is feeding in directly on the ground in individual countries. And also, I suppose there's the question that we touched on very briefly at the beginning around sort of people who are looking to take shelter in other Central Asian countries. So, for example, you know, we've touched on the Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan dimension, but also, are there particular concerns that anyone has about the deteriorating situation of human rights in Kyrgyzstan impacting Bishkek's role as a regional comparative safe haven? I'd be interested to know if there are any questions around that that anyone wants to pick up on. Who would like to go first?
I'll speak. So let me try to speak to one, the question Peter asked about positives, or I can't speak, frankly, to a positive development in Central Asia, I'll be honest. I think that the news has been largely bad. I'll say a word about Kyrgyzstan in a moment, but certainly there's been some negative developments there over the past couple of years regarding this field. On the positive equation, in the US and I think in Europe to come, to be honest, there is more interest in this topic from the current presidential administration in the United States than I think I've ever seen. Not just on this topic, but literally on anything I've ever seen as a human rights issue in the time I've been working on this for about a decade. They are really keen on finding ways to push back on transnational repression specifically. And they are looking at very actionable kind of things that they can do, including things that we kind of can't, I don't want to say they're not secret, but they're things that we can't kind of come up with ourselves because we aren't actual diplomats and actual foreign policymakers. The kinds of things that people do when they do this, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, with hundreds of other people, involving diplomatic initiatives, involving effort to coordinate allies and like-mindeds to drive back. And I think that's really positive. And I think that I have some cautious optimism about what the next year, 2 years, 3 years may bring. In terms of concrete steps, both at policy changes in certain aspects of implementation, and also diplomatic and other kinds of initiatives. And I hope that will have some impact for Central Asia, because I know that one of the things that they are thinking about is how do we communicate with countries that are persecuting states about this? What do we do? But they are also thinking about how do we work with countries that might be cooperating states, right, that are being coerced into cooperation with another persecuting state, which is often the case as well in Central Asia, whether that's China from outside the region or whether it's internal to the region, and there's a level of cooperation. And so I think there's a lot of interest in that. I think there's a lot of willingness to think hard about it and to engage. Yeah, on Kyrgyzstan, I mean, a couple of negatives that I would point to recently. Obviously, the case of Orhan Anande is very disturbing. This is the Gulen University administrator, originally a Turkish national, though he'd actually taken Kyrgyzstani citizenship. He was kidnapped by Kyrgyz security services, I think we can say with a high degree of confidence, by Kyrgyz security services, and then handed over to Turkey in a kidnapping, a rendition, what we would have called a rendition if the US had done it, previously, kind of classic fashion. This speaks very poor of the situation in Kyrgyzstan. Another one that I wanted to highlight, and I'm afraid I'll lose the name here just because I don't have it on the tip of my tongue, but I know a couple of years ago, we had a opposition activist and blogger from Kazakhstan who was arrested in Kyrgyzstan, where he was seeking asylum and then handed over to Kazakhstan rather peremptorily. This was, I think, in 2018. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name off the tip of my tongue, but I can find it very quickly if people want to know the name I'm talking about. And he was then imprisoned in Kazakhstan, prosecuted for what is peaceful political activism. I think that in that sense, there's the notion of Kyrgyzstan as a place of as Alex was talking about these shrinking refuges across the region, it's been a long time, I think, since Kyrgyzstan could really be considered that for the region. If I were to put a date on it, roughly it's been 7 or 8 years probably since that really qualified in the way that it did briefly post-revolution in 2010. So, yeah.
I'll just jump in here and say, one imperfect analogy I would have is the progress that was made in normative pressure via diplomatic channels on human trafficking as a result of the State Department's human trafficking reports, scorecard, and indicators. I'm one who on the record is some skepticism about indicators, but I would recommend a book by Judith Kelly on this scorecard diplomacy. And what she shows is that a lot of the action that happened in diplomatic consults in US embassies abroad, where local officials were really interested in how could they improve their scores on the US State Department human trafficking. And so they talked about some of the practices, they made some changes, some of them were cosmetic, but maybe a few were more substantial. And so diplomatic pressure, if applied in a systematic way, right, that this is a routine thing that is now considered part of the State Department's human rights portfolio, a set of sort of benchmarks and indicators. And I think you can imagine something similar in the EU, if constructed in the right way, might offer some channels for this type of pressure. But again, it's imperfect. And, to me, this is also bound up in the legitimacy of, whichever the authority is that is doing the pressuring. But I do think that there is some scope for a kind of a naming and shaming global vehicle on this. The work of both actually Ed and Nate and their organizations has been great to bring this in the spotlight, but an even sort of, more high profile annual ranking of like the most repressive of the transnational repressors, would at least, bring some sort of attention to this. Final comment here. One thing I really struggle with, and I don't have a good answer on here, is what's the right framework for mobilizing activism on this, right? I think part of the problem, so Nate talked about this, is that this is bound in sort of the norms of the flailing migration regime and refugee regime. And so these people aren't viewed as actual deserving of the protections of the state and of their home governments, right? That's part of the lack of public outrage. They're covered as, wanted refugees. And so the alternative, when we think about, what happened on the Ryanair flight, is to invoke this as a security issue, right? What happened, the downing of the plane in Minsk, happened in a flight between 2 NATO countries, right? A forced, coercive downing of an airliner and abduction. Surely that borders on high security types of issues. But if you go down that route, then you securitize the issue, and you will also leave yourself open to the arguments some of these security services are making. So it's tricky which normative framework to use to combat this. And actually, I'd be very interested in hearing sort of Nate and Ed's, as well as your take on this, Adam.
Thanks. Ed, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just to build off that, I think there's, if we're talking about the specific getting policymakers in the United States interested in this, of course, policymakers are of different stripes, but particularly I'm interested in the fact that the person who introduced the TRAP Act, co-sponsored bipartisan legislation, Marco Rubio, right? And he's not someone who's been known to be particularly progressive on border issues with regards to the US-Mexico border, for example. But because he's very interested in China, and interested in this shift in policy making, thinking towards great power competition, framing this as an anti-authoritarian thing is certainly one way to gain more interest in it, particularly from, if we want bipartisan, speaking specifically in a US context, if we want bipartisan buy-in from both sides. So I think that's one, so slightly thinking in instrumental terms is one way to frame this as being, part of a global surge of authoritarianism, where the authoritarian gravity centers are Russia and China, potentially Iran, Venezuela, is one way to certainly instrumentally sell this. I think in terms of positive developments, and to answer Shoira's question as well, I think two things I can think of is firstly in the very incremental opening up in Uzbekistan and the 2017 decision to release a lot of individuals who were detained on extremism charges is going part of the way. It's certainly a positive development, but we obviously haven't seen full rehabilitation. We haven't seen people like Hamid Ismailov from BBC, obviously very famous dissident and author, being able to return to the country. We haven't been able to see the opposition, Mohammed Saleh, for example, being able to return to the country. So I think it's, that's if we're trying to find positives, that is a positive, a half positive, we could say. It's an unfinished positive. In terms of, and to bridge towards Shoira's question of what the international community can do, I think there are a few positive examples from Tajikistan, for example, where we saw international pressure being able to stop coercion by proxy, particularly the targeting of Muhammad Gabiri, the leader of the Islamic Renaissance Party's grandson, who had cancer and was being denied medical treatment abroad, and also similar issues with the health of Shabnam Pudadoyeva's daughter, who was another exiled activist whose daughter was trapped in Tajikistan and unable to leave the country. So we have seen a number of instances of, sustained pressure between the international community, activists within the country, drawing attention to this name and shaming approach that Alex mentioned on a much smaller scale being quite effective. And I think especially as we look towards regimes such as Uzbekistan that are very, somewhat concerned about their international reputation, raising these issues at meetings and encouraging individuals from the EU and the State Department and others when they visit to raise these issues is certainly, and raise them publicly is certainly one way of applying pressure. But of course, it's very challenging. But I'll finish there.
No, thanks very much, Ed. I'm just Nate, do you want to come in quickly? Just unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of things there to that conversation. I mean, about the approach. I mean, we've tried very hard to not make it a security-based approach. We really think that this frame needs to shift towards protecting the rights of individuals, no matter where they are. And we've actually seen policymakers be receptive to that. That may be reflective of a political moment in the United States or in other countries, a post-Trump political moment, where there are many people who are becoming much more aware of how dysfunctional and dangerous our immigration systems have become, how Kafkaesque they are, even for normal people, for anyone crossing a border. I think there's far more awareness of that among your average person in the United States than there was 8 or 12 years ago. And I think that is an opening for having a hard conversation about why is our system so focused on making this process punitive, making this process something where you may be detained for a very long period of time on unclear charges and without access to any kind of counsel or representation. And all of those things then are, feed into combating transnational repression. The other, so in that sense, I think that there is a little bit of hopefulness on my part that we're going to see some changes. I just wanted to say one thing in respect to Alex's comment about rating or about compilation. This was an important change that actually came after the hearing a couple of years ago that Ed mentioned, the introduction of the TRAP legislation in the hearing in Helsinki Commission 2 years ago, which is that State Department annual reports on country human rights practices actually include a section now on what is essentially transnational repression. They have some other long State Department name for it, but it is a section on that. They are working, my colleague Yana Gorokhovskaya has written actually a piece about kind of comparing what's included and not included so far, now that they've only done it 2 years. But that's definitely one outlet where we see an opportunity to strengthen just the public documentation of a relatively high quality source that researchers can use, that advocates can use to talk about this problem, and then to take it to governments and have that reputational leverage. It seems that Adam may have frozen. Am I correct? So we may have lost our captain.
Yeah.
Did either of you wanted to say anything about the OSCE or the UN, Ed or Alex?
Yeah, just briefly, I think the UN would be an important body to work on this issue. One of the ideas we discussed, I think, at the workshop for Colombia 5 years ago now, where we brought together many of the leading people working on this, was the UN Special Rapporteur, for example. But of course, with China having so much influence within shaping norms within the UN, that might well be a challenge again, and with Russia playing its role within the OSCE and trying to water down the mandate of ODIHR, for example, the human rights, democratic elements of that organization, it would be a challenge. So I think the EU and even the Council of Europe appointed a special representative on Interpol abuse, for example. So that's certainly, I think, the EU and European Council of Europe are areas where engagement is taking place and can take place, particularly to protect refugees from Central Asia and elsewhere who are fleeing to Europe and looking for safe haven. But beyond that, I think working on a bilateral basis is maybe the most productive. And I'll hand over to Alex.
I'm hugely sorry about that. Can you all hear me now? Yes, despite investing in what was claimed to be unbreakable Wi-Fi, it appears to have broken at a rather unhelpful time. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I don't want to disrupt the conversation that's been happening in my absence, but I know we had a couple of questions from some of the people in the chat. One of them was Jamshid, who was asking what sort of international institutions would be effective in helping us address this agenda, whether that's the OSCE, UN. I mean, are there sort of other sort of international forums that can have a proper input on this discussion? Indira was asking about the impacts of COVID, and obviously there's been, you know, across Central Asia, there's been abuse of lockdown restrictions to pursue political agendas. But I'd be interested to know what sort of, you know, bad practice sharing has gone on there, but also you've seen impact on migrant flows out of Russia that have brought a lot of, basically pushed a lot of people out. And has anyone seen any impacts from a sort of transnational repression point of view of some of that instability there? And Nuruddin was asking about the sort of willingness of Central Asia to accept democratic ideals and sort of the extent to which international democracy and human rights norms have struggled to embed themselves in Central Asia or not. I mean, obviously, you know, we know regimes do try very hard to make that case themselves, but it's useful to understand sort of how people on the ground see these sort of practices, and how willing are ordinary people to question the use of government's narratives when they're saying about terrorism or other things to exploit exploit these rules. So how credulous is the public, and how often are they able to see through the sort of abuses that are going on to understand what the regimes are doing? So sorry, that's reframing a couple of those questions, but if anyone wants to chip in on any of those.
I know Ed had said a couple of things about OC and UN. Let me just say a couple more, and then I'm afraid I'm going to have to jump off because I do have something that's expected right at the hour. The issue of the UN, I think Ed mentioned a special rapporteur concept. Overall, we're not quite sure, I guess I would say at Freedom House, at what the exact angle is at this point with the UN. But what we do think we're in this stage, this very important stage of norm diffusion or norm establishment. And that's what matters. And so where that comes out, what exact institutional functional form that takes, in some ways it's just too hard to predict anyway, to like draw up an advocacy plan or something that ends at some sort of particular outcome. But the important thing is that there is, I think, a growing vocabulary around this, around countering transnational repression, around its unacceptability, around what the practices of it are, and how the state's responsibilities to stop it. In a very important sense, it's important to know that we don't need new legal tools per se for this. This is all illegal activity anyway, in the most basic sense. So what we need are to build those kinds of coalitions and build those norms within the institutions so that people recognize it when it happens and take action against it. And the arc in which that will take place over a long period of time. But I think we're actually in a quite positive state right now relative to where we were in terms of getting people mobilized against it. And I'm very sorry to have to go, but I do appreciate this conversation, and it was lovely to see everyone's faces and names from so many friends and colleagues.
Thanks so much.
Thank you
very much. Thank you.
Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Alex, you want to say anything to close, and then we'll hand over to Abakhon to send us on our way?
No, I think we have a lot of food for thought. I think it's, one of the, really interesting dynamic areas, depressing in some way, but also a real opportunity, I think, for researchers and activists to get engaged and really, examine and take this issue head on, because you have so much evidence this happening on a lot of different dimensions with a lot of different normative justifications in Central Asia. So I would encourage those MA and PhD students who are, viewing this broadcast to really, try and grapple with this and take it on because it's a really important topic.
Thank you so much. I think Ed did you say everything you want to say in my absence, or any final things?
No, I think, as I just said in the chat to Noordin, I think his question is obviously very important, but one that will take multiple hours of a lifetime of discussion ultimately, because it's one of the big questions of political science. Maybe reconvene for another whole event on that question.
Absolutely. Okay, well, Abakhon, if you fancy doing that event or anything else, I will hand over to you to say goodbye.
So thank you very much, Adam, dear speakers, our distinguished guest. Really, it was an incredible event, and I think I can speak for all and say that this panel was timely and extremely informative and important for human rights debates and the post-Soviet region. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to everyone who joined our event today. I wanted to thank our panel of speakers and the chair of today's event, like Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, who shared her impression of transnational repression in the post-Soviet space, and specifically how Belarus is suffering through them at the moment. Nate Schenkkan, who detailed some of the aspects of the transnational repression, such as securitization of migration and the digital domains of how the repressions are being exercised. Dr. Edward Lehman, who touched upon the Central Asian political exile database and the mechanism of repression of the Central Asian regimes against their political exiles and dissident groups, and the Uyghurs in China being the top first country to practice transnational repression. Dr. Alexander Cooley, who consolidated the arguments of the speakers and explained the international normative legal context of how transnational repression is being exercised around the globe and Central Asia. And of course, our best friend and our panel chair, Adam Hugh, for facilitating the discussions and raising many important questions. As all we learned from today's meeting, the growth of transnational repression is one of the major challenges to fostering democracy and supporting the rule of law in Central Asia. I personally learned a great deal about this acute human rights issue, and I hope the discussion we had today will contribute to the policy dialogue on the topic. Today's expert meeting would not be possible without the help and support from our valued partners who kindly agreed to facilitate and speak at our session today, the Foreign Policy Center and the OXUS Society for Central Asian Affairs. We really appreciate our partnership and would be happy to have more events with you. Last but not least, I also would like to join Tony Borden that this expert meeting is a part of a series activities under the Amplify, Verify, and Engage project funded by Norwegian government. Taking this opportunity, I would like to thank Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway for the continuous support that they provide us. I hope everyone enjoyed this discussion. The highlight of this discussion will be very soon in our analytical platform, Cabar.asia. And again, thank you for your participation and have a wonderful rest of the day.